This week, I thought I would try something a little different. So rather than just dropping the podcast into a video, I thought I would talk to you all. It's a lot less comfortable, but this week we're talking about vulnerability, so I guess it's fitting. This Sunday, we celebrate the feast of Christ the King, which this feast always gives me a little resistance. Maybe because I live in a country that doesn't have a monarchy. Maybe because this feast feels a little patriarchal. But when I looked at the readings, I think I let go of my resistance. It's interesting, fascinating really, that the gospel reading for this Sunday is not one that depicts Christ in glory. In fact, the reading this Sunday is from Luke chapter 23, verse 35 and following, where Jesus is hanging on the cross between two thieves. And so this depicts him not in his glory, but in abject vulnerability, hanging on a cross, being ridiculed by the Roman authorities, and reassuring the so-called good thief next to him. And maybe Jesus could have changed his circumstances, come down off the cross, thwarted his enemies, but he didn't. He stayed there in that vulnerability, and even stayed there in vulnerability with someone in his greatest hour of need too. The other person, well, I guess the two, one on either side of him, who were also in a desperately difficult situation. What kind of a king is that? Not one at a distance, not one to be feared either. That's the kind of king who's close, who's vulnerable, who's with us. The second reading from this Sunday is often referred to as the Canticle from Colossians. It's in the first chapter of that letter, and it describes Christ as the image of the invisible God. So I took a little time to linger with that, the image of the invisible God. Not Christ used to be in God's image when he was Jesus walking the earth, but Christ is the image of God now and always. As Christians, we don't tend to think of Christ that way, do we? We tend to think that once Christ died, rose, and ascended to God, that he might be invisible too. But that's not what our faith teaches us about incarnation. I used to belong to a church that kind of depicted that image of the invisible God, although it made it visible. And it had an old man with a beard sitting next to a younger man with a beard with a white bird in between them. And they were seated at a distance, and maybe they were watching the comings and goings of all the people in the church, but they were very distant. And that's just not what our faith teaches us about incarnation, is it? And when I think back to that beautiful church community that I belonged to, where I experienced Christ the most was not up there on the apse of the church. It was in the mix of the people there that Christ was in our midst, and I experienced that every time we came to pray together. And that's the incarnation. That's where Christ dwells. The image of the invisible God, visible among us. And so putting these two readings together, I think what this feast is trying to teach us is about the paradox that Christ is. Christ is divine and human, infinite and limited, profound mystery, and as ordinary as bread, all powerful and all vulnerable. So this feast closes the church year, and next week we'll begin Advent. And in some ways, this seems really fitting to close the church year this way and to look toward Advent. We move into that season of waiting for Christ to come into the world as a naked, needy infant, utterly dependent on other people to live and survive. Vulnerable king, vulnerable baby, vulnerable God. So Christ is not invisible. Christ is not high and mighty. Christ is all around us. in each person we meet and within ourselves. So on this feast, maybe we can have some gratitude, allowing Christ, the vulnerable King, to walk among us and with us. And when Christ invites each of us into his kingdom, I hope we each say yes.